Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel. This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the fourth ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations through the phone if you..." But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I just..." She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some. I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them. And stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in. "Don't worry," it whispered, its voice high and waspish. "I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country." Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists. But Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on. She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch, Michelle whispered, hanging up as She stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again. My friends and I like to take what we call an adventure weekend about 3 times a year. We met in college while we were brothers in Pi Beta Kappa. There's Jared, Max, and Raj, and me, of course. PBC is a forever kind of brotherhood, but we took it a little more seriously than most. We all live in different parts of the United States, but 3 times a year, we come together for these 3 to 5 day trips that are just epic. We've gone ziplining in Costa Rica, mountain climbing in the Rockies, whitewater rafting in Mexico, and diving in the Bahamas. We've been all over the world, and though it may seem a little excessive, so what? We're 4 unmarried guys with no kids and great jobs, so our income is still pretty much ours to blow as we see fit. So when Max said we should get a houseboat and go trolling up the coast for 5 days, we were all on board, pun definitely intended. So we met at a little port in Mississippi as he introduced us to the Trawler Queen. She was a 2-cabin houseboat with a living room, a party deck, 2 monster motors, and a galley with enough beer and snacks to keep the party going for 7 days and 6 nights. We were stoked, to say the least, and as Max pulled us out of the marina, we knew this was going to be an adventure for the books. That statement would prove to be a little too prophetic. I haven't really properly introduced the guys yet, and it's important that you get the group dynamic down. Me and Jared were the jocks of the group, a pair of gym rats who were constantly on the grind for the perfect physique. Max was our resident cool guy, just a chill dude who liked to party and usually organized our little adventures. Raj was our brain, and most of us probably wouldn't have graduated without him. He was probably the smartest guy in the frat, and he'd helped a lot of us keep our GPAs up so we could keep our various grants and scholarships. We all had our parts to play, like the A-team, and each of us made up for some shortcoming in the group. Max had charted our course so that we could stop sometimes and spend our nights partying in different ports. Biloxi, Long Beach. Finally, we'd end up in New Orleans, where we'd turn the boat into the rental company and get a car back to our original dock so we could get our cars. It was a good plan, but Raj pointed out that his route took us through several large shipping lanes that would likely bring us close to larger shipping vessels, which, were the ones that used them. They'd probably capsize us if we got too close. Might be better to stick to the less busy waterways if we expect to get the deposit back on our rented houseboat. Max brushed it off. If we take these routes, we're better suited to stop in the party ports. Come on, Raj, live a little. Raj furrowed his brow, but he didn't argue. Roger McCormick, an underprofessor at the college that we graduated half a decade ago, might not be a risk taker, but Raj had learned long ago to roll with the punches when it came with us. It usually came out okay, and Raj enjoyed the adventure as much as the rest of us. We had been out about 3 days, preparing to stop in Gulfport and take on provisions before heading to New Orleans, when we saw something strange in the water. Well, not that strange, I guess. After all, it's not really uncommon to see a rubber duck in the water. It's kinda where they hang. Most of the time it's bathtubs or sinks, though, and not off the coast of Louisiana. I was manning the wheel, playing captain while Max went and took a break, and when I first saw it, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I wouldn't have seen it at all if it wasn't fluorescent orange and riding a huge wave. It was just one at first, a single little guy bobbing on the waves and smiling happily, but as I watched, I saw more of them come up on a swell. They were ducks. Some of them with sunglasses, ducks with scarves, holiday ducks, ducks in all colors, and as they floated past, I laughed, thinking it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. Hey guys, I called down to the others who were playing cards in the galley. Come check this out. Max popped up first, as if he expected trouble. When he saw our little escort of colorful plastic borders, however, He laughed too. It was hard not to. The sight of all those ducks bobbing on the surface was just so weird. It was almost a little too weird. What were these ducks doing out here anyway? The longer I watched them bobbing around, the more it made me kind of nervous as well. Where'd they all come from? Why were they suddenly all around us? It was easy to laugh at them if you didn't ask questions, but hard not to feel creeped out when you stopped to think about why they were here. "Why are there so many ducks out here?" asked Jared, watching them flow around the ship as they roiled in the dark water. "Well, it could be that they're testing ocean currents and swell patterns." Max had taken the wheel again, a large wave splashing against the bow and sending a few of the ducks onto the deck. He gave Raj a weird look, though. "What?" "Ocean current patterns. Sometimes oceanography institutes will release a bunch of rubber ducks and watch wave patterns and changes in tidal flow. They've got little trackers in them so they can plot their course, which helps them decipher currents and stuff." Jared picked up one of the ducks and squeezed it, eliciting a friendly squeak from the smiling toy. "Seems like it'd be bad for the environment. Wouldn't it lead to all kinds of environmental problems?" Raj furrowed his brow as Jared squeaked it again before tossing it into the water. He started picking them up and throwing them into the black soup, a few of them skipping across the surface before disappearing into the night. I realized we'd been a little farther from the coast than Max had meant for us to be, though I could still see it. The lights were far away and ethereal. "That is weird. The ones they usually use are made out of cork or something biodegradable. Even if they're rubber, they usually don't squeak." We watched them come rolling in as the waves got progressively higher. Something was stirring up the water not too far from us, and Max seemed to be steering us towards it. When I mentioned this, he said he just wanted to see what it was. His curiosity piqued. Might be a ship in distress or something. Maybe we could help him. He had some idea of being a big hero or something, but I wasn't sure that we could do anything if it was a big transport ship. They'd have a lot more people than our little boat could hold. A boat that sometimes felt a little full with 4 people on board. We cruised between a pair of buoys, heading into open water as we looked for the source of the turbulent water and the ducks. The rope color made it pretty clear that the area was dotted with reefs and sandbars, and the little islands that dotted the area made it even clearer that caution was required out here. It'd be real easy to come up on a sandbar and scrape our hull or blow our bottom out on a reef, and then we'd be floating on driftwood all the way to the rental agency to explain how we'd taken our boat somewhere unadvisable. We came up with a little inlet, the GPS telling us we were entering a major transport lane, and that was when we found the source of the ducks. Their transport ship had been massive, likely hauling all sorts of things. Most of it was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The ship was in the process of joining its cargo, and as it capsized, it was sending up massive waves and tidal surges. The ducks were coming out of a container that had broken open, and as it slipped beneath the water, it spewed out the floating little knickknacks as they scattered on the surface, pushed by the waves. That should have been the scariest part, the sinking ship, but it couldn't hold a candle to the massive tentacles that were wrapping around the hull and dragging it under. They were hard to make out in the dark of the night, but their undersides were cream-colored and covered in suction cups. They were massive, rising into the air as they came slithering from the depths of the ocean. Even from our position, over 100 feet away, I didn't think any of us felt safe. We were on this creature's turf, bobbing on the surface of its hunting ground, and if it wanted us, there was nothing we could do about it. "We need to go," Raj whispered, as if he was afraid the thing could hear him. "We need to go while it's still mangling that ship." Max agreed, and as we pulled away as quietly as we could, the rest of us kept a close eye on those rising tentacles as they descended into the ocean with the remains of the cargo ship. As we came slowly through the reefs and the bars, we kept expecting to feel a tentacle latch around us and drag us down. The ducks just kept coming, the waves of colorful toys no longer as whimsical as they had been. We had been planning to anchor for the night around midnight, but when I sat up out of a stupor the next day and discovered we were pulling into New Orleans, it wasn't a surprise. None of us had said as much, but I think we were all feeling a little less than safe out here after what we'd seen the night before. The rental company told us they couldn't give us a refund for the days we hadn't used, but we told them that was fine. I didn't feel safe until my feet were on solid ground again, and I've never been happier to live in a landlocked state. We had fun with the rest of our trip, exploring the Big Easy and taking in the sights and smells of the city, and after a few nights of leisure, we started to wonder if it had all really happened. Maybe we'd just gotten spooked by all those rubber ducks after having a little too much to drink. Maybe we had a group hallucination. Maybe we just seen something shadowy out in the ocean and jumped to conclusions. 2 nights later, though, while drinking in a little hole-in-the-wall bar, we discovered that it hadn't been just drunken delusions. We were all laughing after our 3rd or 4th pitcher of beer when Raj suddenly sat up a little straighter and looked at one of the TVs behind the bar. He went over to it, asking the barman to turn it up, and as we followed behind him, we caught the tail end of a news report about a ship that had recently gone missing on its way to New Orleans. The story had a picture of a large cargo ship, a ship that we had all watched get drug into the water a few nights ago. And the news lady was talking about how it was a huge mystery for local sailors. The ship, nearly 100% automated except for a crew of 10, was lost at sea somewhere off the coast of Louisiana. While several cargo containers have been found off the coast as well, the ship itself has seemingly vanished. Residents in the area have been inundated with rubber ducks for the last few nights, and there's concern that the ship may have sunk and been pulled out by an errant current. They showed the footage of a massive amount of rubber ducks washing up on the beach near Long Beach. Watching those ducks go in and out with the waves made me anxious in a way I couldn't explain, but didn't need to. It was pretty clear that everyone here was feeling the same, and when the newscaster moved on to another story, we ordered another pitcher and returned to our table. The festivities were definitely a little muted after that, and it was decided that boating was right out for our future trips. I think maybe we'll go to Vegas next year. Vegas sounds nice, especially after what we saw. The mirror showed Dominic reflections that weren't his own. The mirror was an oddity, but an oddity that he would come to rely on. The hell is this thing? Dominic had been browsing for things he could sell at his local thrift store, and the mirror had caught his eye. It stood out because this shop didn't usually put trash out with their junk. The mirror was fractured in 7 places, and it looked like someone had punched it in the center and sent spider cracks through the glass. At first he thought it was some kind of joke mirror, because when he looked at it, he saw 7 different reflections, and only 2 of them were his. The 2 that were him were on the top right and the bottom left. The left one showed a much younger Dominic as he shuddered on a metal frame bed in Clarence County Prison. At first, he thought it was just some inmate. Everyone kind of looked the same with a bald head and stripes on. But he would never forget that cell. It had the swastikas carved on the wall behind it, the legend that stated "cops are bastards" below it, and the picture of his then wife that he had stuck up with toothpaste to add some color to the cell. It was him all right, but the one across from it was much more interesting. The top right showed Dominic picking up a painting in the art section, a painting with a price tag on it that read $2,000 in your pocket. Dominic was no fool. He wanted to make sure this wasn't some kind of weird trick first. He'd grown up in gangs and living rough, and he knew a hustle when he saw one. It was an impressive hustle, to be sure, but it still smelled like a hustle to him. Dominic went to the little section they had for art, and sure enough, there was a weird picture of women sitting on a balcony, their faces seeming to grin and scream all at once. The price tag on the front was not for $2,000, however, and was for a much more reasonable $10. Dominic thought it over, pulling out his phone as he snapped a picture, and looked to see what it was worth. He found a page for some artist named Roland DePriest, and it just so happened that a lot of his paintings were going for big bucks since he'd recently offed himself. A quick look told Dominic that this was indeed a DePriest, and the going price for it was about $2,000 as of this afternoon. He picked up the painting and the mirror, deciding to take both home with him. "What you want that ratty old mirror for?" asked Mr. Drussel, looking at the broken glass without much interest. Clearly, he couldn't see what Dominic saw in it, and that might be for the better. "I like the frame," Dominic lied. "Think I might use it for something." Mr. Drussel looked at the painting in a precursory way, but shrugged as he tapped it all up on his calculator. $10, he said, holding his wrinkly hand out with expectation. Mr. Drussel did business in cash, and did not truck with the little plastic card machines. "What about the mirror?" Dominic asked, not wanting to get scammed after the fact. "Take it. I can't sell a broken mirror, and the frame looks ugly anyway. If you want it, then by all means, take it off my hands. Just don't cut yourself on the glass. I'd hate for you to try to sue me after I gave you such a great deal on it." Dominic nodded, thanking Mr. Drussel as he left the little shop, with a tinkle of the bell overhead. The painting sold for the proposed $2,000 to a scalper friend of his, and the mirror Dominic hung in his bedroom. For a week, the mirror did little more than show him going about mundane tasks, and Dominic began to wonder if he really had been had. The little inmate still stayed in his cell, sometimes going out for chow, but mostly just staying and looking sad. That tracked, Dominic had spent a lot of his time being sad about one thing or another. Sad that he was stuck in prison for 5 years at first, then sad that his wife had left him towards the end. He tried to figure out what the other spots meant, but they were kind of mysterious. The middle two showed awful things he didn't like to think about. He was a tough guy. He'd been in his fair share of scrapes and seen people get killed in his lifetime, but this stuff was so much worse. People beating kids, people killing their wives, people hurting animals, and everything in between. The one next to it wasn't much better. He could see mothers tucking in starving kids, homeless people crying as they used the last of their money for a bottle of cheap alcohol, even little kids huddled together as they hid from someone. Some of what that mirror showed him was terrible, but some of it was as helpful as the painting had been. The top left panel showed a woman he knew all too well as she went about her daily life. He should know her. She was his ex-wife. The bitch had divorced him while he was in prison, and took most of his stuff while he was too incarcerated to do anything about it. She had taken advantage of him while he was at his lowest, and for that, he hated her. In that respect, he thought of that tab as his eternal enemy, and even wrote it on a post-it note and stuck it to the wall. The mirror turned out to be useful when it came to avoiding her, proving itself one day just as he was about to leave. He was going out on a date, his hair freshly cut and his cologne not too heavy, when someone knocked on the door. His date was supposed to meet him at the restaurant, but he thought maybe she'd come to pick him up instead, and came out of the bathroom towards the front of the house. He was walking past the mirror when he suddenly saw his ex standing outside a very familiar door. She did this sort of thing sometimes, especially if she could Facebook stalk enough information to realize he was serious about someone. He hid out, letting her knock for a while longer, but she finally got bored and left. Dominic was only a few minutes late for his date, and used this little peephole often so he could avoid running into his ex. On the other hand, the bottom right panel showed him an older man he had never met before. Watching that guy was like watching lifestyles of the rich and famous. He ate expensive food, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, and went to bed with somebody new every time Dominic noticed. He decided to leave that label blank for now, not really sure what he was seeing or how it would come to affect him. He found that on days when he didn't have anything better to do, he was checking the mirror to see what he could see. Dominic had definitely found some windfalls from the mirror. The 3 scratch-offs he'd won kept his rent paid, but he was looking for another big score like the painting. On the top right, Dominic was back at the thrift store, but it was a different one today. Dominic watched as he picked up an expensive-looking fur coat, putting it on as he preened a little in front of the mirror. Then, he stuck his hand in the pocket and pulled out a diamond watch that, even to an untrained eye like Dominic's, looked expensive. The thrift store was known to him, a little second-hand store on Mulbank, and after checking that his ex was still at her job, he decided to go see if lightning would strike twice. The thrift store wasn't crowded, and the coat was loud enough to be seen from the entrance. Dominic assumed that it would reek of liquor and cheap cigars, looking like some wannabe pimp's prop, but the coat was in immaculate condition. The tag said it was a Vanderfur, a brand even Dominic was familiar with. He put it on and went to the mirror, preening a little as he'd seen himself do. The coat looked good, very good in fact, and it would go well with some of the shoes he had at home. As he stuck his hand into the pocket, however, it was time for the moment of truth. At first there was nothing. Then suddenly, his fingers touched the harsh surface of an expensive watch. Dominic pulled out a Rolex with, honest-to-God, diamonds on the face. The whole thing gleamed obscenely, and Dominic longed to slide it on and feel the weight of it. This was the sort of thing that he had dreamed of as a kid, driving around town in a fancy car, with a hot girl in the passenger seat, and an expensive timepiece on his arm, in a primo coat. He'd be the envy of anyone he knew, but as he turned to go, he heard someone at the counter asking about the coat. "It was a Vanderfur. I donated it this morning, but my watch must have fallen out in the pocket. Please, I beg you, I need that watch back. It belonged to my father, and it has great sentimental value." Dominic intended to walk right on without acknowledging the man, finders keepers and all that, but as he caught sight of him in profile, he felt his breath whoosh out in a gasp. It was the guy from the broken mirror, the guy who lived so lavishly. Dominic couldn't have said why, but suddenly he was tapping the guy on the shoulder and holding out the expensive watch. "I heard what you were saying, sir. I came to buy this coat and found the watch in the pocket. It's too nice for me anyway," he said, smiling as the joke fell flat. The older man's smile went ear to ear. "Oh my God, thank you, young man. I can't believe how kind you are." "Yeah," Dominic said. "Me either." The man stood mooning over the watch for a few minutes as Dominic paid for his new coat. It was a little more than he strictly wanted to pay for a coat, but he found that he liked it, and it would help him remember a time when he'd been so generous. He started to think that maybe he could sell it for more than he'd paid for it, when someone stopped him on the sidewalk. The guy was running after him, asking him to wait as the watch threatened to slip off his wrist again. "I owe you something, at least, for being so kind," he said, panting a little as he caught his breath. "It's really okay, mister. You don't have to." "I insist," the man said, taking a watch out of his suit coat that looked almost as impressive as the one he was wearing. "My father bought me the watch you found when I was 18 and about to leave for college. This watch doesn't have nearly as much sentimental value, but I think it will help you nonetheless." He put the watch in Dominic's hand and patted it warmly. "I'm in your debt, sir. Hopefully, I can find a way to repay you someday." The watch was nice. Not as nice as the one he had, but still nice. Dominic sold it for about $1,300 and used the money to not only float himself for a while, but also buy a much cheaper timepiece that still looked richer than anything he'd ever owned. He too wanted a reminder of that warm feeling he had felt when he'd done something nice for someone else. With the rent on his dingy apartment paid for the next few months, Dominic was spending a lot of time watching the mirror. He had decided that the panel with the rich man might be his greatest friend, if his ex was to be his greatest enemy. The top and bottom corners were his past and future, and he used the former to enhance his own future often. The middle two were still a mystery to him, but he felt like they might make sense in time. The top panel, The one that took up the most space, however, made him a little more uneasy. It was gray, the sky full of cracks as it swam like a puddle when you throw a rock into it. Dominic felt like he knew that sky, but he couldn't place it. He'd never seen a gray sky like that in his life. Except he had. He knew he had. He just didn't know when. He tried to look at that space as little as possible, but it kept drawing his eye, making him want to take the mirror and throw it somewhere where it couldn't make him feel that way anymore. That was usually how he got stuck looking at the middle two panels. Anything to take his mind off that gray sky full of cracks. The mirror kept showing him things and leading him to opportunities, but it wasn't until he saw one of the faces from the middle panel that he thought he knew its true purpose. He would later reflect on what leap of ego had led him to believe that he knew the purpose of such a thing like this. He was at Marcy's buying groceries one day when he saw a familiar face in line, the true nature of the panel seeming to come to him. He'd seen the woman before, too many mouths to feed and not enough hours in the day to work to feed them. She was standing at the register, her card having been declined, deciding between a gallon of milk and a box of diapers, to diaper the baby or have milk for the other 4. "Here," Dominic said, paying the cashier the remainder from his own wallet. He had no idea why he had been so moved to help, but it made him feel good to do so. The woman thanked him profusely, almost to an embarrassing degree, but Dominic told her not to worry about it. She could pay him back if she felt strongly about it, and here was a little more to get her through the week if she needed it. The woman cried as she tried to refuse him, but the money went into her purse regardless, and Dominic smiled as he watched her go. After that, he began to use his money to help others more often. The mirror helped him invest his windfalls, helped him change his life for the better, and as he grew, so did his altruism. Suddenly he was no longer giving money to single mothers or tipping bills into homeless people's cups, but he was helping the city open shelters, providing programs with startup capital so they could offer meals to people in need, and changing the poverty-stricken neighborhood he lived in for the better. That was how he reconnected with the man from the thrift store, and it was a meeting that would change his life forever. The mirror had shown him that today he would meet someone who would change his life, but he had never expected it to be the man who had begun his charity. As he gave the keynote speech, he could see an ocean of faces that had once looked hopelessly out of the mirror at him. He had given them the hope that they now saw, and the feeling made him tingle. He had always wanted to be someone who could help others, even as he struggled to help himself. He had never realized it. He had something worthwhile to give now, and he was on top of the world. As he ladled punch into a plastic cup, he heard a voice that he hadn't thought of in 4 years. "Looks like you've come a long way since the thrift store. I almost didn't recognize you until you started to speak up there." Dominic turned, and there was the man who had given him the watch. He extended a hand. "We've never been formally introduced. I'm David Rothschild, philanthropist and tech mogul." "Dominic Fraser, it's nice to see you again." And it was nice. The two of them talked for the rest of the afternoon, and when they parted ways at sunset, they were already working out plans for a venture together. Dominic had given him some stock advice, something the mirror had showed him the day before, and the two parted with promises that they'd get together again very soon. Dominic returned to his apartment, the same dingy one-bedroom he'd lived in for years, wanting to see what the future had in store now that he'd found a man like David to partner with. Instead of grand business ventures and philanthropic outreach, however, he was greeted with himself, stabbing his new friend to death. Dominic stared at the mirror for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing. This couldn't be his future. Why would he do such a thing? He had a lot of respect for David and couldn't imagine why he would want to hurt him. It had to be a fluke, a trick of the light. But every time he came back to the mirror, it showed him the same thing. His knife, red with David's blood, and David lying on the floor of his tiny apartment. It never changed. It never wavered. And Dominic decided that enough was enough where the mirror was concerned. He put it in the hall closet, shutting it and its proposed future away for good. At least, he hoped so. He spent a lot of time with David in the coming months. The two did a lot of good for the community, for many communities, and Dominic saw himself living a part of that lifestyle that he'd only seen through the mirror. Jet-setting, eating lavish meals, living the sort of life he had always dreamed about, and with a friend like David, he could live that life with an ease that he had never known. Dominic was the happiest he had ever been, or he would have been if not for the dreams. In the dreams, he always saw himself standing over David's corpse as he bled out onto the tacky carpet. In the dream, he could hear the sirens approaching as he stood over the man like a conquering hero. In the dream, Dominic knew that his life as he knew it was about to come to an end. It started very subtly. Dominic began spending days back at home instead of with David. He was busy with other projects. He needed to give attention to some local charities. He needed to reconnect with his roots and remember the people who needed him. These were all excuses he gave his new friend, but in reality, David had begun to resent his business partner. David Rothschild, who had everything except a criminal record and a checkered past. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if David was going to mess him up on purpose. Did he know that Dominic was supposed to kill him? Was this his way of stealing his happiness? Just like that bitch of an ex-wife of his. Were they in this together? Was she so unhappy with his success that she would stoop to making him miserable again? Dominic spent all his time in his apartment, staring at the mirror and willing it to show him anything but the bloody end of his happiness. When the knock on his door came, he realized he hadn't left that apartment in weeks. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before. Or was it the week before? They clung to him sweatily, and the smell from his pants made him think that he might have soiled himself. Now that he was back from his trance, he wondered when was the last time he had eaten. His stomach growled angrily, and he'd gotten up to go to the kitchen when he heard the knock again. "Dominic, are you there? Your secretary said I could find you here. Are you home?" David again. Dominic got up, walking angrily to the door. He could send him away. Better lose a friend than lose his life. He liked David a lot. He was a good friend, but he liked being a free man more. He had wasted 5 years in prison, and he'd be damned if he'd go back. He didn't care what some mirror had to say. He wasn't going to let anyone jeopardize his future. "Go away. I don't want to talk to you." "But why? What did I do?" Dominic closed his eyes, trying not to let the rage that was building behind them out. What had he done? Like he didn't know. He was only trying to steal his freedom from him. "I don't owe you an explanation. Please, just leave. I don't want to hurt you." "I'm not leaving until you tell me why you're acting like this. I'll stand here all night if I have to. I just want to see what's going on with you. I'm worried, Dominic. I'm worried about you." Dominic didn't remember opening the door, but suddenly the two men were face to face. Some of his neighbors were peeking out of their apartments, trying to see what was going on. Dominic just knew they would be something to talk about tomorrow, and he shuddered to think what sort of stories they might weave. A lover's quarrel? Maybe David had stolen Dominic's girlfriend? Maybe they had stolen money from each other? Who was to say? And all of it would likely paint Dominic the worse for it. "I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see you. Can't you just respect my wishes and—" "Something's going on. You're not acting like yourself. Did someone say something to you? Did you hear something? There's a lot of rumors going around about me. It's the same with most rich people in my circles. I just want to know why you're so—" Dominic was sick of hearing it and shut him up the only way he knew how to. David's tooth flew down the hallway when he hit him, and suddenly the two of them were rolling around the floor and throwing punches. It was the kind of ugly fighting you see in desperate people, and as it rolled into the apartment, Dominic realized he couldn't pummel David into submission. Despite being a decade older than him, the man was in better physical shape than he ever had a prayer of being. As David rained down blows on him, Dominic sent his hands searching for something to defend himself with. The knife was something he had lost years ago, a steak knife that had tumbled from his plate and rolled under the couch forever. but when his fingers locked onto it, he knew what to do. Before he knew what was happening, he was standing over David, the other having been stabbed more than a dozen times. The sirens were coming, and as Dominic let the knife slip from his numb fingers, he realized they had taken it from him anyway. His life, for better or worse, was over now. Well, not all of it. There was still a little more left. The trial had been short. They had found him in the apartment, with the murder weapon, and the victim, his prints all over both of them. There had been witnesses that had seen the two fight, and it seemed to be an open and shut case. The Rothschilds found a slew of witnesses willing to testify that Dominic had been the aggressor, and with his checkered past, all his lawyer could do was get him life. It had been a sham of a trial, and Dominic didn't know why the court had bothered with it. They wanted him to be guilty. The Mirror had told him as much, and now his life was over. The guards at Clarence County smiled knowingly when they saw him get off the bus. "Welcome back," that smile seemed to say, "and didn't we tell you you'd be back?" As he lay on the floor of his old cell, the cell they'd seemed to think it was so funny to put him back in, he realized what the gray sky had been showing him all along. As he lay on the filthy floor and looked at the cracks in the ceiling, he finally realized why they had looked so familiar. This was his life now, his life and his death, and he wondered how long he would have to look at those cracks and that pitted, pitiable concrete before someone came along and put him out of his misery. If the Mirror knew, it certainly wasn't telling anymore. Mark and I grew up together, meeting in nursery school when we were about 2. We played with the same toys, learned the same games, read the same books, and when we started school, we were both delighted to find that we were in the same class. I didn't really notice the chair at the foot of his bed until we were 6. We were playing Super Nintendo in Mark's room, being rambunctious and probably making a lot of noise. Our game of Mario Kart had turned into a little bit of horseplay, and when I bumped into the old wooden chair at the end of his bed, he jumped up like he'd been scalded. He picked it up, dusting the seat like it might be offended as he placed it carefully back where it had been. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to push your chair over." "That's okay. It's just got to sit there. It's kind of important." "Why is that?" I asked as he reached for his controller to go back to playing the game as if nothing had happened. "Oh, that's where my guardian angel sits at night." He said it in that way that made it very clear this was both something he believed in and was as normal to him as the toast he'd had for breakfast. When he noticed I hadn't picked up my controller to begin playing again, he looked back at me in confusion and seemed surprised by my look of stunned interest. "Your what?" "My guardian angel," he said. "What, you don't have one at the end of your bed every night?" I told him I didn't, and he seemed surprised. "Huh, Mom said everybody had them." He tried to go back to the game again, but I found myself much more interested in this guardian angel thing than our game of Mario Kart. As kids, you get used to hearing your playmates spout out about all kinds of odd things. Sometimes they don't really make sense. This, however, had been endorsed by a grown-up. To a kid barely into his 7th year, the word of an adult was still something I put a lot of stock into. If his mom had told him this, then it had to be true. And if a real angel sat at the end of his bed every night, then I wanted to know more about it, or even see it if I could. "Okay," he said, so when I was little, I woke up and found something at the foot of the bed that scared me. I thought it was a monster at first, but when I went and told my mom about it, she said it was my guardian angel. After that, we left a chair so that it could sit, since before it had just been standing at the foot of the bed. "And it comes every night?" "Every night. And now I'm not afraid of him, since I know that he's there to watch over me." The whole thing interested me greatly. Mark's family didn't strike me as particularly religious. I don't even think he went to church. So the idea of Mark having a guardian angel, and not me, was a little bit weird. If it was a real thing and Mark wasn't just pulling my leg, I wanted to see it too. That was when I started bothering Mark's mother, my mother, and Mark about having me over for a sleepover. We were getting to that age where sleepovers were pretty common, but it seemed like they just never had a good time to do it. There were always weekend plans. My parents were religious, so we always went to church on Sundays. I started trying for Friday night, or Saturday maybe, but there just always seemed to be something to stop us from spending the night at his house. As if in answer, Mark came to stay at my house a couple of times. That was fun, but it ultimately wasn't what I wanted. We couldn't see Mark's guardian angel at my house after all, so I kept asking and asking if I could stay the night, and finally we found a time that made it work. We were in 2nd grade, a whole 2 years after I started asking, when my parents suddenly needed to go out of town and didn't have a way to bring me with them. It was right in the middle of the school year, and they needed to go to a funeral from Thursday morning to Friday night. It wasn't really the sort of thing you could bring a kid to, and I suggested that maybe I could stay with Mark. My parents liked the idea. We had hosted Mark a few times, so his parents could have a date night or visit relatives, and so they called to see if it was something they could do. Mark's parents said they'd be happy to help, and I was filled with excitement as I packed my bag for a couple of days at Mark's house. Wednesday night was a blast. Mark's dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard while we played on the slip and slide. Mark's mom had rented a game from Blockbuster that we took turns playing. We watched some TV in the living room. His parents said we could stay up a little later than usual, and when his mother said it was time for us to get ready for bed, I felt excited all over again. As I lay on my pallet that night, sleeping in the shadow underneath Mark's bed, I was filled with anticipation as I watched the chair. I'd waited for years to see this, and I wasn't going to sleep until I saw it. The chair just sat there, a mute hunk of wood, and as the lights went out and Mark's last-minute chatter turned into soft snoring, I tried my best to stay awake. I wanted to see it, but as I began to yawn more frequently, I wasn't sure I'd make it. I wondered if Mark really had just been pulling my leg, and as the alarm clock on the nightstand went from 10:30 to 11, I thought it'd be a real joke if there never was an angel, and he'd just been having a laugh at me all these years. As my eyes grew heavy, I tried to keep awake until it got there. Inevitably, though, I lost the fight and fell asleep. I came awake suddenly in the unfamiliar darkness of Mark's bedroom. It was very early, and as I sat up with a start, I remember feeling that momentary sense of confusion. Where was I? What was going on? That was when I remembered that I was at a sleepover at Mark's, and why I was at a sleepover at Mark's. I glanced up at the chair, expecting to see something in white robes with wings and a halo, but I was disappointed in that respect. Disappointed, but utterly terrified. What I saw was a shapeless shadow with vaguely human proportions. The dimensions seemed to move when I watched it, though I don't think it had noticed me. It was leaning forward in the chair, staring at Mark like a hungry shark, and it didn't turn to look at me until I started screaming. It shifted its soupy face towards me, and I saw a pair of dancing red eyes amidst the miasma. It went right on looking at me until someone turned the lights on, and as the room came into view, the creature was just gone. Mark's mother was sympathetic, asking what had happened, and I lied and told her I just had a bad dream. She bought it, I think, but I think Mark knew what I had seen. He tried to ask me about it, but I rolled over and faced the wall as I pretended to go back to sleep. Mark tried again as his mom took us to school the next day, but I didn't want to talk about it. I was as terrified of what I had seen as I was disappointed at the outcome of my curiosity. My parents picked me up from school that day, having gotten back a little early, and I think they too sensed that something had happened. I slept more soundly in my own bed than I ever had before, and I never asked to sleep at Mark's house again. I may have never asked to spend the night at his house, but Mark and I remained good friends. I still went over to his house, I still hung out in his bedroom, but I never stayed after dark again. Incidentally, since the sleepover had been such a success, his mother let Mark stay over at our house more often. This seemed to work better for Mark's parents, too, and looking back, I don't think they got along well. They argued a lot, and many of the trips they took together ended abruptly without helping their marriage. When they divorced after Mark graduated high school, I think it was only really a surprise to Mark. They decided to sell the house and split the money, and Mark decided to move out on his own and start his adult life a little earlier than he had expected. So, when he asked if I wanted to be his roommate, it seemed like a no-brainer. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college Mark was attending, and it was pretty cool. We got on about as well as 2 high school kids moving in for the first time together could. There were arguments about chores, loud parties that probably bothered the neighbors, late-night underage drinking sessions where we told each other all sorts of things, and plenty of general day-to-day life stuff. The things we had meshed well together in our new home, except for one thing he had brought from his old house that stirred up some memories I didn't want to think about. I was helping him move his things out of the back of his dad's F-150 when I caught sight of something that I hadn't thought about in years, though it had played quite often in my nightmares. Picking up a stack of boxes revealed a familiar wooden chair that had sat at the end of Mark's bed for as long as I could remember. It was the chair that the angel had sat in and watched him sleep. I asked him why he had brought it with him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. It's where my guardian angel sits. Duh. Why wouldn't I bring it? I had kind of hoped that the angel was just an at-his-house kind of thing, and the thought that it might be in our apartment at night gave me the creeps. My boss had been asking if I'd be interested in working the night shift for months, and after seeing that chair sat with such care at the end of his bed, I went and told my boss that I was ready to accept. I wanted to live with Mark and help him out, but I just couldn't stand being in that house at night. I could tell that Mark was a little miffed that I wouldn't be at home at night. Night was kind of the only time he wasn't at school or work, but he understood that the bills had to be paid. I don't think he actually understood why I'd taken the night shift. If I was off, I always kept my door locked and slept facing the wall. If the angel ever came into my room, I never knew about it. I certainly never left a chair at the foot of my bed, and I guess if it came to our house, it stayed in Mark's room. Though I guess in the end, it worked in Mark's favor. I was at work one night, playing on my phone and watching cameras, when my phone rang. I saw that it was Mark and figured he was just making sure I was going to be home in the morning before he had to go to school. When I picked up, however, he sounded frantic. Mark was yelling about needing me home right away and how he needed help calling the police. I told him to calm down and just go ahead and call the cops, but he said he couldn't until he cleaned up a little bit. Then he said the most chilling thing I'd heard since we were kids. The angel got him. Got who? I asked, still not sure what was going on. The intruder that broke into our house. I called my boss and told him about the situation, and he agreed to come work for me so that I could get things sorted out. I offered to come back, but he said there was no need. I was probably looking at police reports and other paperwork anyway, but to let him know if I wasn't going to be in tomorrow night so that he could make arrangements. He even said he'd pay me for the night. My boss was a good guy, one of the best bosses I've ever had, and I always appreciated how helpful he was. By the time I got home, Mark was in a tizzy. With good reason, too, since it looked like someone had exploded across his floor. There was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood across the bedspread of Mark's bed, as well as hair, meat, and bones everywhere. The bones were splintered and broken, and everything looked like someone had been fed into a wood chipper. I didn't know what to make of it, but the most striking was the blood splashed across the plain wooden chair that sat placidly amidst the gore. I pulled Mark into the living room and asked him to tell me exactly what had happened. After a few glasses of water and a little scotch, he finally stopped shaking enough to tell me. He said he had heard the guy come in with a key, and he thought it was me. He had rolled over and went back to sleep, already seeing the angel there and feeling safe as he usually did. When he heard rustling in the living room, he thought it was a little odd, but figured I was just settling in for some gaming. When his bedroom door opened, he knew something was amiss. I didn't usually go into his room at night, especially not after what Mark considered bedtime, and the door opening made him turn to confront whoever it was. He had sat up in bed, looking at the person silhouetted in the hall light, and that's when he saw the angel turn its head to look at the intruder. "What the hell?" the guy said, his voice deep and confused. Mark said he had taken a step into the room, fiddling with something in his pocket, but he never got out what he intended to use. Suddenly the angel was standing, and Mark said it just sort of blurred at the guy. He knew how that sounded, but it was like 1 minute it was standing beside the chair, and the next they had been face to face in the doorway. He had reached out towards him, his hand sinking into the man's chest, and the intruder had made a noise like he was having indigestion. The angel simply pulled him to pieces. He had ripped him right down the middle, long ways, and that had been where most of the blood had come from. He had thrown him against the wall, well, half of him, and the other half he had dragged to the floor and began to eat. Mark said that had been the worst part, watching it eat. It didn't eat like a normal creature. It ate by pressing its formless head against the body. Parts of the body just disappeared. It was like watching something that I couldn't see devour somebody. As it ate, Mark had gotten shakily out of bed and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room. He had watched the thing as he went, unsure whether it would hurt him or not, and when he came to the door, his hands trembled as he reached for the light switch. Just as the lights came on, the creature had looked up in surprise. Its eyes almost looked betrayed, and as he dissipated, Mark was left with the remains of its feast. I don't know what to do. The cops are never going to believe that some weird angel that I've had since I was a kid tore this guy apart. This is a little excessive, even for a home invader, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. It's probably going to incriminate both of us for me to put this in here, but we came up with a story that wouldn't sound quite so crazy. The story was that Mark had been in the bathroom when the guy came in. Mark had locked the door and hunkered down to wait on them while they started taking things. While hiding, Mark heard something going on in the bedroom, and when everything had gone quiet, he came out to find the guy like that. It was a shaky story. The cops were likely to raise an eyebrow at it, but Mark isn't a very big guy, and the idea that he might have hidden instead of trying to confront a home invader isn't too far-fetched. No more far-fetched than the idea that he could rip a guy in half. So we called the cops, and after answering some questions and a trip to the station for some more questions, we were put up in a hotel for the night while they checked out our apartment. It turned out that the guy who had come in to rob us was the landlord's nephew. We've had several apartments that had been broken into without much sign of a break-in, and the cops finally had their answer. The nephew has been using the keys from the main office to go into people's houses, and he usually chooses places where no one was likely to be home. I'd met the nephew on the on-site gym a few times, and he knew I worked nights and likely thought my apartment would be empty, not realizing I had a roommate. They found a lot of evidence at the nephew's apartment, an apartment owned by his uncle too, so the case seemed pretty open and shut. Most of them thought that he'd had an accomplice who was on drugs or something, and the two had just gotten into a brutal exchange over some of the plunder. We actually got a small reward for calling it in, though I think our landlord had mixed feelings about the whole incident. Mark threw the chair out after that. He just didn't feel safe with it at the end of his bed anymore. The angel had been his guardian, and it had protected him, though maybe a little overzealously. It's unclear whether Mark would still be alive if it hadn't been there, but it seemed that, like me, Mark had seen more than he was comfortable with when he'd seen it attack the guy. He put the chair by the dumpster, and somebody must have taken it because it was gone by the next day. I don't know if the angel still comes back to the foot of his bed or not, but if it does, I guess it's standing these days. I was a child of the late 80s. This was a time when kids played till the streetlights came on, and riding your bike through town was as normal as going to the corner store to get your mom some smokes. In fact, the woods seemed to be the only place Dad had specifically said was off limits. The woods seemed to be a boundary for many families, and I never knew anyone who went there willingly. It's one of the few things that stayed the same to this day, though so many others have certainly changed since I was a kid. One prime example was the telephone. Coming from a small town, my telephone was on a party line, so if you wanted to talk to your friend, you went to his house and you did it in person. I was pretty fortunate in that respect. My best friend Davey lived right next door. If I wanted to ask him to play G.I. Joes or ride our bikes, I could just walk 20 paces rather than digging my Huffy out of the garage. Unless, that was, we decided to use the tin can phone. The tin can phones were something we had cooked up after watching a science show on TV. The guy on the show had hooked a pair of tin cans together with twine and showed that no matter how far you went, you could still hear the person on the other end of the can. Davey and I had thought that this was just about the coolest thing we had ever seen, and we set about making some for ourselves. I found a pair of old soup cans and a long spool of Mom's twine and attached the end to the cans. We could hear each other pretty well, a fact that surprised us to no end, but the farther away we got, the harder it became to hear each other. "Let me show you a different way," Dad said, startling us a little since we had been so involved in our little project. He had linked the cans together with some fishing line, and the connection had been the next best thing to crystal clear. We used them a lot, linking our tree houses together with the phones, and we could talk into the night on them as we camped out in different tree houses. It wasn't as clear as a telephone, but it was amazing the conversations we could have over just a simple little device. When Davey got grounded one summer, they became our only means of communication with each other. Davey, you see, had gotten himself into a little bit of trouble. He had gotten addicted to the new arcade that had just come up downtown. The laundromat that had once been there had been cleared out, but I can remember smelling detergent and fabric softener every time I went to play a game of Pac-Man or Galaga. Davey and I went there a lot, but Davey seemed to have developed an unhealthy love for the games. Any money that he could scrape together was shoved into the arcade machine, and I remember noticing that he was absent from school in the middle of the day and suspected that he had snuck off to the arcade. When the truancy officer brought him home around lunchtime one day, his parents finally decided that enough was enough. He was grounded for the summer. They told him that he might manage to earn some of his stuff back with good behavior, but forbid him to go to the arcade until he could get a handle on his addiction. Davey and I talked over the tin can when we could, but Davey made it pretty clear that his parents would take that away if they found it. We would camp out every weekend when the weather was fair, and we talked most of the night, me suddenly being Davey's only real connection to the world. So when I picked up the can one night, calling for Davey through the 100 feet of fishing line, I was surprised to hear someone else pick up right away. As it turned out, though, it wasn't who I was expecting. "Hello?" said a small voice, not like Davey's at all. It sounded like an adult trying to do a bad imitation of a kid's voice. "Who's this?" it said again, and I remember shaking off my uncertainty as I remember that Davey liked to do voices sometimes. Davey and I sometimes listened to the radio DJs prank call people, or we'd catch comedy performances on the satellite TV Davey's family had. Davey had a few characters he'd been working on, despite the fact that they all just kind of sounded like him, and I assumed that this was nothing more than another bad character performance. "Who's this?" I challenged back. "This is Sam," the voice said, still high-pitched, but getting a little surer of itself as the string made it sound tinny and robotic. "But my friends call me Tin Can Sam." Yup, definitely a new voice. If it had been modern day, I would have said that it reminded me of Herbert the Pervert from the Family Guy show. It was 1991, however, and all I could equate it to was the funny way that Michael Jackson talked. The voice was funny, kinda, but it still just sounded like Davey doing a bit. "Okay, well, Sam, why do they call you Tin Can, then?" "'Cause I wear the tin cans I empty like jewelry and clatter everywhere I go. I'm a hobo, you see, and most of my meals are taken from cans. Who do I have the pleasure of conversing with tonight?" I played along and introduced myself to Tin Can Sam. He asked me if I went to school, and I told him that we were out for the summer. He asked if I lived around here, and I told him I lived next door. He asked me how old I was, and if I knew the kid who owned the treehouse, and a dozen other things as I played along. Some of you guys will think this is weird. Why would I surrender a lot of information to Davy that he would already have, especially if he was doing a bit? Well, to answer that question, you'd have to understand how Davy was when he was doing a character. Davy was one of those people who would commit to a role. If he was doing a new character, that person didn't know you. Interacting with him was like meeting Davy all over again. But he was my friend, so I put up with it. At least it wasn't Grandma Gerda, who had a memory problem and constantly forgot the things you told her. So I played along with the game, asking Sam what it was like to be a hobo.
It's all right, I guess. I used to own a hardware store, but the people didn't like me very much, so I had to leave. It's rough not having a house sometimes, but I meet so many interesting people on the road.
What do you do for fun? I asked, nodding to myself at how thoroughly Davy had committed to the role.
Tell stories mostly. Sit around the fire at night and eat your dinner and tell tales. We especially like scary stories.
Scary stories? I asked, a little taken aback. Davy was not a fan of scary stories. He liked to play it cool, but he was a bit of a scaredy cat at the core of it all. When we watched the scary movies sometimes, the volume low so his parents didn't catch us, Davy always hid his eyes and sobbed sometimes when the killer got somebody. Sam liking scary stories was not something I was prepared for.
Do you like scary stories?
Sam asked, his voice sounding hungry for the answer. Yeah, I like scary stories.
I got a real scary one if you'd like to hear it.
I nodded before realizing he wouldn't be able to see me and told him that I did. I was still absolutely sure that this was Davy doing a bit, but the longer I listened, the less sure that I was becoming. The longer I listened, the more the voice sounded less like Davy and more like a stranger.
Good, 'cause it's a real scary story. It's about these kids who were camping in the woods one night. They didn't have a tree house like you, but a tent instead. They had set up far from town where they lived, and they camped at the site often. They came there for a sleepover one night, but they didn't know that there was an extra in their party this time.
I sat on the fluffy orange rug I had taken after Mom was going to throw it out and felt my teeth trying to chatter. If this was a bit that Davy was doing, then it was better than usual. As the string brought his words to me, I remember feeling my spine shudder in my back. This was different. Way different. And I wasn't entirely sure that I liked it.
As I came up, they heard me. They looked out to see what was making so much noise, peeking from the zipper as they looked into the once inviting woods. It was dark, though, and the woods were dense. As I moved about, rattling and shaking, they kept looking around anxiously, trying to figure out where I was. The more I moved, the more it scared them. They thought I was a ghost or some sort of spook, and the longer I rattled, the more they shivered. It was windy that night, and I seemed to be everywhere.
Oh, okay, Davy, said my voice shaking a little as I watched the fire and my lantern dance. I don't like this game anymore.
Who's Davy? I told you my name's Tin Can Sam. Now where was I?
I looked out the window, trying to see if Davy was in his treehouse, but the branches of the big oak his dad had built it in obscured the structure. All I could really see was the string as it hung taut between us.
Oh, that's right. I could hear them whispering over there, discussing their chances if they ran. They didn't think they stood a chance if they stayed, but if they ran, well, they believed I could only catch one of them. They were arguing, starting to yell, and as they got louder and louder, I crept up to their tent. I'd have had them then and there, but suddenly they burst out of the tent and ran in every direction. I smiled as they ran, knowing that I could easily catch more than one of them.
Stop it, Davy, I yelled, the story creeping me out, and when coupled with the voice he told it in, I don't want to hear any more. Despite this, I felt unable to take the can away from my ear.
I caught them, and I cut them. I sliced them, and I diced them. I cut their throats, and I sliced out their tongues. I cut their legs, and I took off their fingers, and when I turned my attention to the third boy, I knew I could get him before he got home. I took off after him, my cans rattling like ghostly chains. He kept glancing behind him, hearing my clatter as I got closer and closer. His feet slapped against the ground, and if he'd hit a single root, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I was so close, my knife still wet with his friend's blood, and as I lunged, he jumped over a small fence and came into his backyard. I stood, watching as he tripped and rolled onto the grass of his house, and when he looked back, I melted into the woods. His race won.
I let the tin can fall to the rug, not wanting to hear anything else as I scrambled to the ladder to my treehouse and pulled it up. Unlike the children in the story, I was not in a tent. I knew that no one could get me if that ladder was up, and as I dragged it into the treehouse, I could see a shadow as it hunkered at the edge of the fence that separated my yard from Davy's. It was a man, a skinny wisp of a man, with strings of cans hanging off him. He looked up at me as I looked down at him, and even in the dark, I could see his broad white teeth as he grinned. I slammed the trapdoor shut, but even in my tree fort, I wasn't outside his reach. As I hunkered on the carpet, I heard his voice ooze from the can as he left one final word on the matter.
"Tell your father. He was right to tell you to be cautious of the woods."
He may have said more, but I threw the can out the window then and heard it tonk as it landed in Davy's yard. I spent the rest of the night with my knees against my chest, jumping at every sound outside as I listened for the clank of cans. I didn't come out when the sun came up, and when someone called my name from the ground, I jumped in surprise. Looking out my window, I was happy to see that it was my dad. I came down the ladder, leaping into his arms as I cried against his shoulders. "What's the matter, kiddo? You have a bad night?" he asked, smiling but clearly concerned. I felt him stiffen when I told him what Tin Can Sam had said, and I felt him hug me even tighter. "I'm so sorry," he said. I never slept in that treehouse again, and after I told Davy about what had happened, I don't think he did either. I'm an adult now, and my parents' house is my house. After Dad died of a stroke while I was in college and Mom passed away a few years later, Melinda and I decided to move into what was the largest part of my inheritance. Our children love the big backyard, the treehouse that I've refurbished and repaired, but I always warned them to stay out of the woods. They always begged to be allowed to explore, but I've put my foot down where the woods are concerned. I've never seen Tin Can Sam again, but if I ever think that maybe I imagined it, all I have to do is listen carefully on quiet nights. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the clank and jangle of the old cans as they blow in the breeze.